Hello and welcome to the Disruptive Innovation Festival, the online festival of ideas that asks the question, what if we could redesign everything? Now, what role can the circular economy have in financing basic income? Is a basic income our future social safety net? And how exactly can we finance it? Today, we're joined by Leonard and Paul, strategic designer and director of strategy at Spark Reply, which is a strategy and design firm. My name's Emily, and I'll be your host for this session. Please remember to add your comments and thoughts into the box below this session or on Twitter by using the hashtag ThinkDiff. We'll be doing a Q&A section at the end, so please do keep posting your comments and thoughts into us. I'm going to hand over to the guys now who are going to get us started on the conversation.
Thank you, Emily. Len and me are joining you from the Munich studio.
Hi. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, so thanks a lot for the intro, and we really encourage people to post their questions in the box because we really want to do this in a conversational style way. What we are here to do is essentially put forward a couple of ideas which we have regarding how we could finance basic income in a circular economy. So maybe just to start off, Len, why are we talking about these issues today, actually?
All right. Well, first of all, welcome. Thank you for joining us. To be honest, I think the fundamental issue here is that today's politics, as well as business, is not necessarily focusing on the three primary issues that we see in the world today. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, we have environmental issues, which are currently not being addressed or not addressed enough. At the same time, there are, let's say, global structures in place to try and solve, if you will, this environmental crisis. And I'm consciously not calling it climate change because that's a fairly neutral term. And on the other hand, we have these social conditions. The poverty gap or the wealth gap, however you want to frame it, is increasingly growing. And then as a third part, what we see is that the political drive and the political reality of our society today is, I would argue, increasingly well, unbalanced. Let's put it like that.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we know there's a couple of initiatives and concepts which are tackling exactly these issues which you mentioned. And they are already out there. We've at QB, we've actually been building on these building blocks, as we call them. So maybe you can start with the one of the commons, because it's most likely one of the most, let's say, neglected in our current economic paradigm, right?
Yeah. So for those of you who aren't aware of the commons essentially states that, let's say, land, but also non-renewable resources, water, air, soil, are part of the collective ownership, i.e. everyone living on this planet has a share in this particular environment. Now, what we see today is that there's a lot of companies, but also governments who are massively profiting from giving away these shared resources. What we believe as Kubi is that, in essence, in order to start structurally addressing the issues that I've mentioned before, is to actually regain the concept of the commons, which is actually a very old concept. Even the Romans were implementing this with regards to the distribution of grain, for instance. So if you were a Roman citizen, you would actually receive grain simply by virtue of being a Roman citizen. And there's plenty of examples around this in the UK, but also in Europe with regards to agricultural lands and grazing lands. The second one, obviously, is the universal basic income, right? And the universal basic income is essentially a, let's call it, a given right to having a livable wage. Most people in this session will be aware of how it works, and there's a lot of different examples which we'll come to later. And then the third one is obviously the circular economy, where in essence it's a, let's say, move away from the waste-based society economy that we have today towards a closed-loop economy, which means that there will be a probably slow reduction of waste and loss, if you will, of energy and resources throughout the production process.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so do we see any of these being implemented today, or do we see these concepts in action?
Yeah, some of them. I mean, there is currently a major push for the circular economy, as the organization of this particular conference already shows. At the same time, what we also see is that there's a lot of different pilots around the world with regards to universal basic income. And there's a lot of different forms. So, I mean, on the one hand, we speak about universal basic income. On the other hand, we speak about basic income, which refers mostly to poverty alleviation. Thank you. The interesting thing is that across the board, whether it's in the so-called Western world or the so-called developed world, developing world, is that there's actually mostly positive effects coming from the introduction of these pilots. So, for instance, Give Directly, if I'm not mistaken, in Kenya has the largest pilot running at the moment, which includes something like 40 long-term initiatives, where you're looking at, I think, 12 years of universal basic income for families. And at the same time, there's initiatives in Finland where it's more about poverty alleviation. And so far, things are looking very well. In the longer term historical perspective, if you will, there is something that most people will have heard of somewhere, somehow, is the Minicom experience, which was actually, interestingly enough, cut off before the results were being analyzed. So 40 years later, or 35, when they started analyzing this data, they actually found that it had major long-term positive effects.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so there's three concepts here, right? Just to recap. There's the commons, there's the circular economy, and basic income. And QB essentially is trying to build upon these three building blocks. And maybe you can just tell us then what is QB?
Yeah, sure. So first and foremost, QB is open, right? The idea is not that you and I, as founders of this initiative, are running this thing. The idea is really to create, let's say, an open source framework that enables the introduction of this concept. That's one. Two, it's a participatory environment, therefore. So that means that businesses, governments, academics, but also individuals who are generally interested in this project can participate. Now, the general premise of Kubi is the fact that through this wave of innovation that we see throughout the infrastructure in our worlds, how businesses and governments operate, and how our daily lives are being affected by technology, is that with this increased transparency across the world, there's two ways to go, right? We can go, if you will, the Google model, where all of our data is being privatized and in essence being made profitable for private companies, or we can go the other way, where we say, okay, now we actually have the opportunity to create completely transparent value and supply chains. Now, if we were to go down that second part, then the opportunity we have is actually to create an environment where we can start seeing what kind of resources are being used, by who, and in what manner. Now, if we take that as, let's say, an initiative to increase the transparency across our corporate world, the second level could be that we decide, hey, why do we not actually start taxing, if you will, by lack of a better word, these resources, which, under the principle of the commons, belong to each and all of us across the world. Now, if we were to do that and introduce a global fund, which, I mean, how that essentially works governance-wise, and not government, but governance-wise, I think is something that we need to figure out in the next year. But this could then be used to accumulate the, if you will, the monetary value that derives out of either the use of these resources or the profits that are being made off these resources, and then redistribute in the form of a basic income or a universal basic income. And yeah, that's more or less it.
Mm-hmm. So what you're talking about is essentially trying to solve these two major issues at the same time, right? Solving the environmental issue while also contributing to solving the social issue, right?
Correct.
So,
sorry to interrupt you. The key reason for that is that the two do not live distinctly. They are inherently part of each other. Yeah. So this is why we need to move towards a more, again, by lack of a better word, holistic approach where we can solve these kind of things.
Yeah, agreed. So I'm guessing a lot of the people in the audience are asking themselves the question of, okay, this is a theory, but how do we move things into practice?
Yeah.
What happens, how do we create a political willingness, for example, for such an idea to happen?
Well, let me take one step back. I think first and foremost, the most important component is to actually get a diverse group of people involved in this. This cannot be a small group of alternative thinkers that come forward, which is why I think the acknowledgement of needing business, government, NGOs, and individuals in the form of academia or just people in the design field or in the IT field to come together and actually, let's say, start moving towards a solution. And whether that the solution is could be as it stands as a concept now, I don't know. But to answer your question, the political willingness, I think, is something that we are also collectively responsible for. If we do genuinely believe that we live in democracies, which I think most of us do, or at least from a statistics point of view, we claim we do, the realization that we need to start voting with the longer term in mind and not be swept up in the media narrative that the current party leaders or their party members are trying to push forward in terms of actually getting lost in the short-term narrative, right? And again, this is a collective responsibility. We need to start breaking out of the quarter-driven economics as well as the four-year term government cycle, or 5 years, depending on which country you are.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So I'm going to ask one or two more questions, and I would like the audience, if possible, to really write your questions in the chat in case there are any, and I'm going to pick on them right after. So we talked about political willingness. Another point which is really interesting is what about the companies, right? Because for the companies, taxing them means it becomes more expensive. And essentially, because of basic income and the influences of on work itself, they're going to have a tough time finding talent.
Right.
So it's a very expensive solution for the company.
So let me start with the talent part. One, what we see is that especially our generation, so this whole marketed millennial generation, is actually generally already not particularly interested in working for large companies. And this is something that we need to keep in mind, right? I think 80 companies across the world are responsible for 78% of all pollution, right? So if we take that in mind, that's a very small percentage of all companies around the world. Two, the fact of the matter is that I would argue if we want to increase talent to be, or sorry, increase the attractiveness of these companies towards talent that they'd like to attract, especially in the younger part, they need to start sticking with a mission. This is something that we see also with our clients, where the longer term, again, the longer term focus of a company strategy or a business strategy is often lacking in terms of actually, let's say, being circular, pun intended, with regards to their impact on society, how they operate within that society, and also what is their responsibility within that. Now, on the second level, with regards to taxation, quite frankly, again, the Paradise Papers have shown us that companies are not particularly interested in paying taxes, which is fair enough. This is the incentive of our current economic paradigm. Now, that said, I would argue that it might be time to actually start realizing that there is no separation between the civil and the business world. At the same time, companies are not unidentifiable colossus. They are made of a group of people who, let's say, point in the same direction with a mission, right? Now, if we can, we as people can actually put ourselves in a position to start driving these companies into this direction, taking their responsibilities and contributing to the key issues that we're facing in the next 3, 4, 5 decennia, we can actually solve these problems. As you've seen after the US withdrew from the Paris Climate Agreement, what you saw was that a lot of companies went, no, we're still part of it. Whatever our federal government is doing, we are part of this commitment. And I think it's going to require a similar kind of commitment from companies to say, okay, we are also part of this society.
Mm-hmm.
and therefore we are okay with actually putting some of the money in there.
So I see what you're getting to here is that we need to be, let's say, open and proactive and actually willing to experiment with our current models also in order to get there. But what is the spectrum of this idea?
I don't know. I always say there's only two kind of people that can predict the future. One of them are clairvoyants, which I'm not, and the second ones that are full of shit, which I think I'm also not. Sorry for the language. So the fact of the matter is, what we're trying to do with Kubi is to establish a theoretical model which can be tested from an economic performance based by PhD students, by universities across the world, as well as by businesses in terms of feasibility within their business model, to actually say, okay, after a year, we have a framework that is ready for testing. Now, based on that, we can actually start reiterating, because this is also another thing. I don't think that a universal model for this particular setup will work everywhere in the world, because there's different social realities, there's different economic realities that we need to keep in mind. So moving forward from that, I hope that with contributions from people around the world, we are capable of actually creating a theoretical framework that is ready for testing in the next year, which then I suspect it's going to take another year to actually properly peer-to-peer review it, and then actually publish a, let's say, Creative Commons licensed model that can be adopted by people around the world.
Okay, so let's say we're one person in the audience. How can they actually get involved in this?
So in essence, go to our website and sign up.
Website is circularubi.org, by the way.
So this would be step one. And I mean, for us as well, this is an experiment to see how this flows and whether people are actually generally interested. Because maybe we're just two weird people in a corner sitting and talking, and nobody actually agrees with us.
Might very well be.
Sorry?
Might very well be.
And so I think this is step one. And in the next 2-3 weeks, we're going to reach out to people and actually ask them for contributions to make profiles around what we're actually trying to do, and then see who can be contributing. So the idea is to create a collaborative online workspace where people could contribute and actually start figuring out how could this work.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Thanks a lot. Emily, I think we're going to pass it over to you if you gather some questions.
Yeah, great. That was a fantastic discussion from both of you. So thank you so much for that. You made it really clear, went into much detail as well, so that's fantastic. So the questions are flooding in, which is great. So I'm going to start off with a question from Laura. She says, interesting discussion. She may have missed the beginning part, but she's really interested in exactly what Spark Reply do, and what companies can get involved and how exactly companies can get involved.
Okay, so without this becoming an advertising for our employer, in essence, we're a strategy and design firm. That means that we operate on 3 levels. 0 to 2 years in terms of innovation on products and services, 0 to 5 years in terms of larger scale transformations, and 0 to 5 years in terms of really, like, let's say, points of view on what could be the future of society. So I'll cap that there. How can companies get involved? I think that very much depends on what the company is doing, and at the same time what its ambitions are. We're currently open to everyone who is willing and buys into the idea, so to say. The next step would then be to really figure out, okay, how could you contribute? What are you willing to contribute? Is it in terms of people in your team who are interested in this idea and want to help us build it? Is it, I don't know, locations for events? Is it money? Is it, I don't know. So this is very much open, but we welcome all interest, and would love to start a dialogue with these companies to actually make it happen.
Great, and that's a reminder to everyone that's watching this session, you can keep your comments coming in about anything to do with this session, and these guys will get back to you. So even if you're watching on demand, you can still post your comments in the box below. So we've got another question here from Twitter. And they say, what would your perfect definition of how finance in a circular economy can work? How would you define circular economy in your own words, and how would you place finance into that?
You want to take that? Okay, I'll take it. So from my perspective, there's a more fundamental discussion with regards to the financial world. What is the purpose of money is one of the questions that we're going to have to ask ourselves. I think some people are already asking themselves that question. But the fact of the matter is that this is part of a larger social and also psychological mind shift that is already ongoing. I think this conference is a very clear sign of that. Next to that, what is the future of cryptocurrencies? How are they going to play a role within our societies? With regards to the definition of circular economy, the foundation is we need to move away from the waste model that we have today. And I think also from a financial perspective, the inclusion of what is currently referred to within the circular economy concept of externalities. Non-renewable resources, water, soil, air, are something that we need to start quantifying from a financial perspective in terms of how much profit is it generating for those using it, and what should be coming back into, if you will, the social profit that comes out of that in terms of the commons.
Yeah, this whole model is essentially about including all these elements which are being left out today. It can be, as you said, waste, or it can be people who get abused in various ways because of the system.
Great, you answered that really well. Thank you for that. Following up on a sort of similar concept, so Bershna, she says circular economy is based on a systems thinking approach. In that we need to think about things and systems, and how do we make this work in the concept of basic income?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, if you look at structures that govern the world, these are all systems, right? I think we've slowly but surely moved to a point where we no longer actually discuss the systems and the structures in which we function. This initiative is essentially about that, that we start questioning the structures and systems in which we function and start figuring out how we can move beyond, if you will. Because the system is not the people, right? And this is something that's very important to understand, I think. Next to that, systems cannot be given responsibility. We cannot say that, our current system is responsible for X or Y. It is the people who function within that system who are responsible for X and Y. And this is something in terms of accountability that we believe this increased transparency that we will require in the circular economy, as well as in the opportunity, if you will, of this whole industrial IoT that will be rolled out in the next 5 to 10 years, will enable us to do. Mm-hmm.
Great, thanks, guys. And this is taking a slightly different turn, but very much related. So, taking it right back to the root of the problem, where does basic income actually start? Does it start in the small villages, the bigger cities? Which nations are primarily involved? And I guess how does it vary, across nations and countries?
Obviously, one of the main principles around the circular economy is also locality, right? Current world where things are being produced in China and shipped for thousands of kilometers just to be disposed immediately is clearly not really a viable system in the long term. So when you're able to produce locally, you have stronger regions, stronger cities, which reinforce the ties with the citizens. And then with this local regional power, essentially also comes the ability to say, okay, we're gonna be able to offer to the citizens X amount of dollars or euros or whatever. So it would be generally, I think, really regional differences.
If I may add to that, one of the key things of the, let's say, innovative wave that we're seeing, for instance, going back to Tesla's introduction of the autonomous truck, which they expect to be in the market in a couple of days, this is going to have very local impact, if you will. Because of the fact that these technologies will be rolled out in one part and not in another, jobs will be affected around that time and around that space. The fact of the matter is we haven't barely spoken about automation, which is going to have an impact, right? So this will be one of the components. At the same time, where are factories being optimized? So we already have the first non-human logistics centers, for instance, where there's literally only 10 people working, processing over 1 million packets a day. Now, in regions like that, it would make sense to actually start creating a solid social basis, which allows us to avoid, well, the depression, if you will, of these societies.
That's a great answer, Leonard. Thank you. And it's really great that you brought up automation. Actually, Age of Automation is one of our DIF 2017 themes, and obviously it plays a part. So that's great that you fed that into the conversation there. So we've got a fairly long question coming up now from Harrison, but I think he's really explained it greatly, and he's got a really good analogy within the question. So I'm just going to go for it. Bear with. So he says, if we tax the shared resources, how do we distribute the wealth? For example, if a company removes the fish from the sea, how much would they pay, and who would pay before this? Who governs and ensures the appropriate people are compensated, and how can we prepare underrepresented populations to manage this influx of wealth? So fairly long question. Who wants to take that one?
Yeah, I'll have a stab.
Great.
So with regards to your first point with regards to taking the fish out of the sea, I think that's actually a really good example, seeing the fact that it covers all three of them, right? It covers the commons, i.e. who owns the fish in the sea. It covers let's say the privatized profit that comes out of it, and it covers consumption. So I think that thank you for that. On the commons component, I think there also we cross a part with regards to the environmental aspect of this entire story, namely that we've already extinguished over 70% of all fish in the ocean. I think this is a good starting point, if you will, in terms of the value chain of a fish, if you want to call it that way. So at the point where we see that a certain action destabilizes the ecosystem in which that particular resource lives, this is a taxation, I would think, but again, this is an open framework and this is merely my opinion, that we should actually start looking at both sides, both the quote-unquote production and the consumption. When you look at the agricultural lobby, for instance, in Europe, which is one of the strongest lobbies in the world, at the same time, it's also one of the largest polluters in the world. Now, at the point where your choices are directly impacted, financially impacted, I think we will be able to start moving beyond the current paradigm, right? It is all about incentives in society. So looking at the particular fish, at the point where we see that both let's say the fishermen, which is not an easy job, right? I mean, at the moment we're trying, or the fishermen, if you will, in the world, right, and women, who are trying to battle the overfishing that we've been doing for the last 30 years, it's actually really difficult for them to have a good year. At the same time, people eating fish are often not aware of the fact that the ecosystem is being threatened by their simple act of eating sushi, which might be beautiful on your Thursday evening and this and that. I get it. At the same time, this is what I meant before with regards to responsibility and accountability with regards to what we do. And so moving on to your underrepresented civil groups, honestly, I don't have an answer for that. I have a, let's say, a point of view, which is in essence that we should give these people an opportunity to figure it out themselves, which means that, and you can have a look at Give Directly, there's really like, there's essentially the mobile banking based, I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but in Africa, there's a really large mobile banking network that functions on SMS. Which provides people with the monetary value. Now, what the case study of Give Directly shows is actually that children stay in school longer, children are not forced to go to labor, their environmental awareness increases, families are healthier in general, population health is better, medical support increases, and there's a lot of different ones. So let's say I'm leaning towards that model. At the same time, I'm not informed deeply enough, and this is again also one of the call outs, if you will, for people watching. If you are, please join, because these are the questions that needs to be answered. Yeah.
I would really recommend having a look at the website. Essentially, they're saying that giving cash to people is good, and it's people are not abusing it as popular culture would say it. And there's actual research on it. So
because this is often the response to universal basic income in whatever geographical context. It's either people are lazy, people don't get it, this and that. However, it shows all across the world that if you give someone who is poor money, they actually help themselves, which is a very logical thing. We all have this survival instinct. It's often just that we don't have the resources to do it, or people who are under the poverty line, so to say.
You made some fantastic points there, really well-rounded answer to a very deep question. So thank you for that, and I'll be sure to cut back on my sushi intake as well. Don't worry. So we've got lots more questions come in, so I'm just going to jump straight into the next one. This one's from Seb. He says, I love this topic. He says, what is the key to moving the ideas you're speaking about from conceptual to practice? Is it number of people who are aware/educated about it? Is it key individuals in policy, for example? So about how we move this concept, further down the line, what is the future of this concept?
Yeah, I think we tackled part of this question before. I think the point here to make is that it's actually everyone. It's generally a need for people to be open to new ideas, and what we are trying to do here is why we call it a movement, is because we want simple people to join, but we also want people who work in businesses, government, academia to work together, bring them together, and figure out how this can function.
So to build on that, let's say QB's mission is really this framework, right? And that has, let's say, several maturity steps going into the future. So as we said before, we're looking to develop this theoretical model, which is then also scrutinized by people outside of the movement. Which then I would argue the, let's say, academic track would be to actually have it tested from an economic perspective in both policy level and business level, to then actually put it out there and say, all right, ladies and gentlemen, here we are, use it. Right, and then obviously, I would imagine that there would be advisory members from our movement joining people who are trying to implement that, and then our background is in strategic design, so it's not likely that we'll be having workshops modeled around this, but that's really longer term reality, and something that we don't know where this goes. So, let's see. But that's currently the thinking in any case.
Yeah, that's exactly right. We don't know where this goes, and that feeds perfectly into the next question. It seems like it's lined up, but it's not, I promise. So Teresa says, if we were to adopt this scenario, if we were to live in a world where universal basic income existed, what would it look like? What would jobs look like compared to now? What would this scenario be in your eyes, I suppose? So in your eyes, how would you expect this vision to look like?
Well, let me take a step back. What's the purpose of work? Right. Today, sadly, it is actually a reality that most people don't necessarily like their jobs. In the Western world, in any case, I think some of us here are lucky enough that they love their jobs. But keep in mind, there is a majority of the population that doesn't. So that's question number one. At the same time, I think we'll have a slightly more balanced work life, if you will. Right, introduction of new technology made it so that we're essentially always online, always accessible, et cetera, et cetera. At the same time, that also causes major pressures and this and that. Now, with the introduction of a basic income or a universal basic income, I think we have the opportunity to start rebalancing, one, the way we work, two, also reducing the amount of jobs that are being perceived as redundant, right? I don't know, people who are processing the same type of data 1,000 times a day, not great. Do you want to say something? Okay, sorry. And in doing so, I think we will be able to allow people to actually start pursuing their personal development needs, right? You might, I don't know, have an absolute love for something out there, being a chiropractor, and your day job doesn't allow you to do that. Simply because the fact that you only realized that you wanted to be a chiropractor when you were 32, and now you don't really have the time to do a full-blown course to be a licensed chiropractor, etc. Now, a universal basic income would allow you to say to your employer, okay, I'm going to work 3 days a week. This kind of flexibility in the employment model will also, I think, massively improve the balance in terms of the loss of jobs, right? Because at the point where we have automation with an estimated, I think, 800,000 job losses related to autonomous driving, for instance, we're going to have to figure out how this is going to play out. So I think it will increase freedom. I think it will increase, let's say, psychological health, to be honest. And third, not most importantly, I think it will allow people a bit more space in their lives.
Yeah, and keep in mind what we just mentioned before. So the studies, again, from Give Directly, they actually point out that people do not become lazy. And these are essentially very poor people which were receiving these cash transfers. So research says that they're actually going out there, maybe starting a business, maybe doing something for their own families.
And the same actually for the Minicom experience, which was the earlier one that I mentioned in Canada in the 70s, if I'm not mistaken, where yes, they saw people started working less, but not in order to sit on the couch, eat chips and watch television. Yeah? They did so in order to spend more time with family and loved ones. They did so in order to do a new education, all these kind of things, which are, I would argue, from a, again, personal health perspective, quite a positive component.
Great. I guess initially people would think that would be the answer, that people would become lazy and you'd sit around, but
the interesting thing is, like, there was this study, it's on our website, have a look, but about the feasibility, or at least the let's say reflection of society today on the universal basic income, which indicates that 68% of the people are willing or stand positive towards the introduction of a universal basic income. At the same time, they think 30, I might be mistaken, but somewhere around this number, like 37%, that they expect others to get lazy, whereas only 8% themselves would actually start working less, which is a very interesting discrepancy. And I think we live in a society that doesn't really trust each other anymore. And you know, this is one of the key answers that you get from people when they say, oh yeah, so but that's going to happen. Well, yeah. Would you? No, I wouldn't. Okay, yeah, but my neighbor probably would. Yeah, maybe he or she does. But you know, 9 out of 10 people wouldn't, which is, I think, the most important component.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and these studies sound fantastic. And yeah, I'd encourage anyone online who wants to find out more to head to the website. Paul, what's the website again?
It's circularubi.org, which stands for Circular Universal Basic Income.
Fantastic. So yeah, I think these studies are great examples. So if anyone that's keen to find out more, please do head to the website. So the session has absolutely flown by, but we've got time for one more question, I think, if that's okay with you two.
Sure.
Yeah? Sure. Cool. So this is a fairly long question again, but I think it will round off the session really nicely. So this is from Rabin. He says, I mean, we touched on this earlier in terms of like when we talked about different perspectives around the globe, but how can least developing countries follow the circular economy model and afford the basic income system? These countries really need to follow the circular economy. However, some problems these countries face are expensive technologies, lacking awareness, lack of financing, which might delay the model. So what would your response be to, you know, the uptake of this in less economically developed countries?
I'm going to, again, step back. That's what I do. One of the key misconceptions with regards to the so-called developing nations is that they are being helped so much by the West that they should be able to have fixed it by themselves right now. The unfortunate reality is that we pull out more than 60% of value that we push in, i.e., let's say the Western world puts in 100 million, which is not the actual number, but just for illustration purposes, we put in 100 million as aid, and consequently, we pull out almost, I think, 100, percentage-wise, I think it comes out at 160 or 170 in terms of economic value. This is what one calls post-colonialism. I think this is the largest problem that developing countries face. At the same time, then there is the subsequent political structure that is created in order to maintain post-colonialism. And I mean, I know these are not popular things, and you know, it could be seen as a very political statement, but it's really not. It's looking at the structure of the economy. There's no ideology behind it. It is how does money flow and what are the consequences of this money flowing in that particular manner. At the same time, again, going back to earlier statements made with regards to UBI given to poverty-stricken people and the way they treat that money is actually very positive for the individuals. So, you know, I think it's very much about stepping away from the top-down approach for developing countries and actually moving towards a bottom-up approach for them. And this is not dissimilar to what I believe will happen in Europe or in the US for that matter. I think, you know, an unpopular example of that is Donald Trump's rise to power, which, you know, this did not come out of the blue. It was preceded by the Tea Party and then moved on and on and on, all the way to Donald Trump in the White House. These are grassroots movements in a very similar sense as that we are a grassroots movement. And I think, you know, empowering people across the globe to actually gain access to financial means, and then also open sourcing the knowledge that we gain across the world with regards to how we can structure this, how organizations of the future will look, how technology of the future. I mean, there's so much open source technology out there today that, I mean, it's mind-blowing, and a lot of this stuff can be fixed. Now, combine that with the decentralized structure that a circular economy would need in terms of manufacturing and production. I think we have a very solid basis to start developing a new paradigm.
That's great. Really great answer again. I think, yeah, we've managed to avoid politics throughout this whole session, but it's bound to come up at some point, isn't it? Trump always comes up. So, yeah, no, it's obviously a really important side to all of this, you know, the political side. So, yeah, great that you touched on that. So that was going to be my last question, but we've had a really great one come in. So sorry about that, but I've got one more for you. So this is from State of Design Ltd. They say, through the localism and redistribution of resources, which you seem to be promoting, do you see a return to protectionism and erosion of competitiveness at international level? Quite a deep question, but happy to tackle it.
Maybe. Honestly, I would argue that despite today's mainstream narrative with regards to globalization and the free trade, the reality is that banking profits are privatized social profits. Most of the central banks are public property and redistribute the money to the banks, which then lend that money to companies who don't actually need it, and these are largely corporations. So next to that protectionism, you know, have you seen what the US is doing at the moment? Have you seen what is happening in Europe? New trade agreements, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The whole wave with regards to the, and I forget the name right now, or at least it slipped out, but the trade agreement that was between Canada, US, and Mexico, as well as the one that was cancelled now between the US and essentially the Asia Pacific, as well as the one between the US and Europe. These are not about free trade. These are about, in essence, turning the legal framework in which trade happens towards the benefit of a lot of the powers that be, if you will. I think what we're talking about is strengthening local resilience. At the point where today, I don't know, oil goes up with $2, the reality is that our bread gets more expensive. Through decentralization and through creating also local ecosystems in terms of environment, produce, and all these kind of things, the key step forward there is to actually create a more resilient local community that is able to feed itself. I think this is really the level where we need to start looking at if we want to move towards a new paradigm from an economic perspective. That is the key thing, because right now the global food distribution, for instance, is actually causing the erosion of our soil, is pushing the use of pesticides and you know, a variety of other, I would say, not particularly beneficial components. So I don't know if I entirely answered your question, but I think this is really fundamentally about thinking about how can we create human life on the planet. And I'm sorry if this sounds slightly existential, in balance with the environment. I think this is really fundamental. Money is a human concept. However, clean water is not. And I mean, again, that sounds fairly philosophical, I suppose. But this is the level we need to look at. And honestly, if we don't, we're going to have a very serious issue in the next. Well, some people, depending on where you live in the world, already have a major issue. And you can be as protectionist as you want with regards to your economic market. The reality is that the climate crisis is projected to produce over 200 million refugees over the next, I think, 20 or 30 years. The reality is we need to start creating ecosystems that are in balance with the reality, which is supported by an economy that strengthens that, and not the other way around.
Yeah, so maybe just to add to that, the circular economy at heart, and one of the reasons why the circular economy, why we're talking about it today and it's gaining momentum, is because there have been already very successful businesses, organizations which are operating at a local level. So maybe this local trade, let's call it, will be actually the replacement for this global trade which we have today.
Yeah, I mean, there's probably going to emerge a couple of levels, I suspect. But maybe that's because I suppose we're running out of time. But I would suggest to look at something which is called transition towns, which are actually about creating a balance between localized life and globalized life. And this is not an either or. This is a complementary component between utilizing the best what the world has to offer, and at the same time ensuring that the local community is strong and not particularly vulnerable to global economic crises. And this is something that we really might have to start looking at for the future in terms of sustainable development of our societies at large.
Yeah, I'm sorry to challenge you so much right at the end, but I think that really rounded off the session nicely. I think it's obviously through the conversation has become, well, it always has been very apparent that there is something deeply wrong with our current economic system. So, even though that was a challenging question, I think you really rounded the session off nicely there with your reply. So thank you so much to Paul, and thank you so much, Leonard. You've been fantastic guests today, and thank you so much as well to our online audience. Your questions have been challenging but fantastic. And if you are watching on DIF On Demand, don't forget to still post your comments and thoughts in the box below, and I'm sure that Paul and Leonard will answer them at some point. I'll bug them over the next few weeks to get to those. So yeah, there's many more sessions coming up at the DIF, don't forget that. So tomorrow I'd really recommend tuning in to Ken Yang. He's got a session on designing the regenerative city. That's at 11 a.m. GMT, that is. So please do tune into that and have a look at the schedule, because there's much more happening. And don't forget, you can always catch up on DIF On Demand as well. So that's it from us, that's it from Leonard, that's it from Paul, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.